WatchCharts is the world's leading secondary watch market research platform. Dive into the data yourself at WatchCharts.com. A lot of discussion around the market in 2022 rightly centered on the price correction experienced by hype watches and the overall decline in the secondary watch market. But at this point, we are well and truly into 2023, which is turning out to be a somewhat different story altogether. In this video, we will cover 3 brands that are up and coming. We examine where they were, how they got to their current state, and why we're optimistic for the remainder of their 2023. But first, what does it mean to be up and coming as a brand? This here is a comparison chart for the performance of the indexes for the overall market index, as well as 2 brand indexes, but the brands are not labeled for the moment. But what you'll see is that over the last 12 months, the overall market, as we all sort of understand at this point, is down by about 25%. But the brand that has an index value of around 11,000 has gone up 8.1% in that time. And then a different brand, which has an index value of 3,276, has gone down by only 4.6%. So it's not done as poorly as the overall market index has over that time range. And it seems to have started experiencing sort of halfway through that period of time, somewhat of a recovery. So are those indicative of long-term trends? Of course, it's never really obvious, but the fact that both of these brand indexes have done better than the market and continue to be on a seemingly better trajectory than the overall market suggests that they will continue to outperform the market in 2023. And so that, I think, really is what we mean by up and coming here, that they have sort of consistently outperformed the rest of the market. And so, like I said, there's 3 brands that we'll talk about here. The first one is going to be Bulgari. And Bulgari, in the chart that I showed you before, was the chart that actually experienced a little bit of growth over the last year. So if we just look at the index comparison chart for Bulgari and the overall market, the difference in overall performance over that time range comes into sort of even starker relief. While the market fell by about 25%, over the same period, Bulgari sort of steadily, without dropping a beat, rose just over 8%. And this is just over the last year. This is a continuation of a trend of an upward trajectory that Bulgari has been on for the last 2.5 years, which is the sort of extent to which we have calculated the brand index for Bulgari. So it's not sort of shown here. The comparison chart doesn't show the full time range. I'll flash the 3-year view on screen for a second, just so you can see what that looks like. But what it'll basically show is that Bulgari has been on an upward trend for basically as long as we've been publishing the index. And if you look at the brand index itself, the chart has 3 years, but like I said, we have data going back to Jan 21 for the index. The stability of the gradient really is quite remarkable over that extended period of time. Over the last month, it's sort of gone up by 0.9%. Over the last year, it's gone up 8.1%. So, the sort of current sort of short-term trend does seem to be holding with the longer-term trend as well. What I would sort of add to this particular view is a couple of observations around how much of the brand's secondary market activity that we can see this brand index captures. So as our brand indexes, you may already know, contain up to 30 watches that have the highest transaction value in the previous 12 months leading up to Jan 1st for that specific brand. And then, of course, like if you look at a model family, and we're computing the index for a model family, the same sort of logic applies. But in this instance, the Bulgari brand index is capturing over 90% of this brand's transaction value on the secondary market and nearly as much of its transaction volume. So this trend basically is not just indicative of some sort of subset of Bulgari watches being traded on the market. It really does reflect almost the entirety of what we can see of Bulgari watches being traded on the secondary market. And so for the entirety of that set of watches to be doing this consistently well over this long a period of time, I think is quite a remarkable achievement. I think one way to sort of demonstrate why Bulgari is even being talked about as a brand in a discussion about watches is to just actually talk about some of the biggest hitters that they have released over the last decade. And, it starts off with the carbon-based minute repeater, which when done in titanium was the world's thinnest minute repeater when it was released. The second watch you see here is the thinnest automatic perpetual calendar in the world. Also happens to be automatic. The third watch that you see is the thinnest automatic chronograph in the world that also happens to have a GMT function in the subdial at 3 o'clock. And this is sort of like a real serious demonstration of real watchmaking prowess. In this instance, of course, specifically focused on ultra thin watchmaking, which is arguably sort of a sort of complication on its own. But these are sort of done to the extent that it really almost doesn't matter whether or not you think of ultra thin watchmaking as a complication or not. These watches are just incredible for what they've been able to accomplish. And so to just sort of keep the accolades going, they produced what at the time was the thinnest watch in the world. It is now the second thinnest watch in the world, the thinnest tourbillon chronograph, and then in the same watch, the thinnest tourbillon, the thinnest automatic watch, and the thinnest automatic tourbillon at the time. And so to have done all of these things all in the same sort of family, I think is really what's given within Bulgari's catalog, of course, the Octo family, most of the spotlight. But of course, there's the Serpenti as well, which is record setting in its own way because there's a Serpenti watch that features the smallest tourbillon ever made. And so the quality and the seriousness of the watchmaking that is going on at Bulgari is without a doubt, I think, up there with anybody that you would want to compare them with in terms of whether or not they're quote unquote real watchmakers. But the base that they have established over the last decade and the strengths that they have to build on in terms of the depth of their product catalog and the success of the products that they've already released within that catalog, I think will sort of help power them through the rest of the year. And I expect very much to see that trend continue, barring any sort of, externality that we can't account for. Let's sort of talk a bit more specifically about a couple of the more sort of attainable Finissimo references. This is just the stainless steel reference in black with a black dial reference 103297 and with a blue dial reference 103431. Both of these retail for $18,800, and that's sort of after a handful of price increases, and they have market prices around the $10,000 mark, which both of them have actually risen over the last year. So the black dial is up 7.9% in the last year, and the blue dial is up 5.6% as well in the last year. And for sort of these more bread and butter sort of references by Bulgari, for these to also be appreciating, I think is just sort of further evidence. And if we look in fact at the full set of watches that have risen in value over the last year by more than 10%, there are actually 7 of them in the index of 30 watches. But as I mentioned before, all of them happen to be Octo references. So I think that sort of covers why for Bulgari, just sort of, if you look at the data and you understand a little bit about how the brand is currently positioned and what is likely to be on their roadmap for the rest of the year, why that will continue to sort of contribute to the same trends that have led up to where we are today, where their prices on the secondary market have appreciated as steadily as they have. But of course, that's not the only brand that we said we were going to talk about. The second brand we'll talk about, and again, we're going to dive into the numbers for this one, is TAG Heuer. This was a brand that saw a decline, but over the last year, but did not see as much of a decline as the overall market. And so you see that comparison chart here, but in this instance, actually over a 3-year time period, for which the overall market index went up by almost 48%, and the TAG Heuer market index rose 9.7%. But of course, as we know, in early 2022, the overall market index sort of saw this peak and then subsequent correction, which is also sort of, there's a little bit of a hump visible on the TAG Heuer index as well, around the same time period, followed by a very gentle decline. But there has since sort of, been a correction, and we'll talk through why we think, sort of over the remainder of 2023, we expect that to not necessarily trend in a downward direction. But if we sort of zoom in and just look at that view again, and this time over a 1-year time range, what we find is what we sort of started out the discussion with, which is that the overall market is down about 25%. And then over the last year, the TAG Heuer market index is down, just over 4.5%. But the recovery really is noticeable, because before it started around December, November, the brand was on a downward trajectory to lose at least 10% of its index's value over, at least that period of time. And so, I think if you then look at just the brand index in isolation, in absolute terms, over the 3-year time period, it's certainly up. And then over the last year, like I said, following the rest of the market, it sort of went down, and it's, sort of recovered since then. And whether or not that recovery sort of continues upwards or holds, I think will become sort of a little bit clearer with time. The other interesting sort of thing to look at is why exactly this trend arrested. So why, at the end of November 2022, did the brand index performance just sort of suddenly turn on a dime? And the answer, for people who may not recognize the gentleman on the screen, is a motorsport that is watched by nearly 500 million people around the world, called Formula One, for which Max Verstappen, who is on the screen, happens to be the current Formula One world champion, driving for a team called Red Bull, sponsored by a watch company named TAG Heuer, winning the world championship, sealing the title earlier in the season, but winning the championship sort of officially at the conclusion of the season in November 2022. And just to sort of drive home the point, there on his wrist is a black Monaco chronograph. And of course, it's not the only TAG Heuer watch he owns. And what's fascinating is to see just how sharp that turn in performance seems to be around that point in time. And we've sort of dug through the data and tried to figure out if we can find other causes that may explain why that sudden spike might have happened, but there really doesn't seem to be anything other than just Red Bull winning last year in 2022, not just the World Driver Championship for the second year running, but also finally the Constructors Championship after a dry spell. And of course, if you need further confirmation of that, if you look at the watches that over the last 6 months, for example, so that would include basically that period starting in November, the watches that have increased in value the most, by looking at the 6-month changes, then there's a heavy sprinkling of chronographs and watches from the Tag Heuer Formula One family. So why does this bode well for the future? Well, currently Red Bull is leading the constructors title for 2023 as we sit in early May. Max Verstappen is admittedly by a small margin at the moment, but still we're only four races in, and the season still has 19 races to go, leading the Drivers' Championship. And so the halo effect that perhaps winning the Drivers' Championship 2 years in a row and then winning the Constructors' Championship and then being poised to win both titles again this year is just going to, I think, multiply with time. Not only is Red Bull winning, Red Bull is expected to dominate for the rest of the season, and there is nothing in the rules to suggest that that domination will change in any real shape or form until 2026 when new engine regulations come in. So the halo effect basically is just going to be on an upward trajectory for that amount of time. And it'll be interesting to see if TAG can sort of, go along with Red Bull Formula One team along for that sort of ride in terms of its secondary market performance over the next 2 to 3 years, while Red Bull is expected to dominate the sport. But the reason I sort of talk about it in such detail is not just because I think it's seminal to understanding the Tag Heuer secondary market story, but also because, to offer full disclosure, if it wasn't already obvious, I am a Formula One fan. So we will move on for the final brand to talk about a British watchmaker named Christopher Ward. And in this instance, we're actually not going to be using any secondary market data because we do not have a lot of it. And some of that is because their watches don't often come up on the secondary market. And given how many they're making and how many watches they're selling and how sort of successful they are, that there hasn't been more of a secondary market around them, perhaps is a sign of how much their buyers love their watches. But, that's always only just one part of the story. So what we'll actually talk about first with Christopher Ward is the watches that they make, because I think that sort of, as Lewis Hamilton says, his dad always said to him, do your talking on the track. So we'll actually look at the watches that Christopher Ward makes and start sort of, curiously enough, on their website, there's a single view, which I quite enjoyed, certainly in doing the research for this video, but a single view that shows you all the watches that they sell, of which there are 247 in counting all of the variations and whatnot. And the most expensive watch that they sell is the C1 Bel Canto for $4,210 in a 41 millimeter titanium case on a titanium bracelet. And if you're not already familiar with this watch, it's a super complicated watch because it chimes on the hour, the passing of the hour. And so, right now, for example, on the watch, the time is set to 10:07, 10:08. As time elapses and the hands go round and it goes to 11 o'clock, as it hits 11 o'clock, the hammer, which is roughly at the 7 o'clock position on the dial, on the bigger dial, will hit the gong and basically signal the passing of another hour. And to do that at this price point, at most, there are variations of this watch on straps and whatnot that you can buy for less, is just, unprecedented to my knowledge. And, groundbreaking in more ways than one to make complicated watchmaking accessible, to make a complicated watch in the first place, to believe in the value of complicated watchmaking at a time when everybody seems to only want to talk about integrated bracelet sports watches, which unfortunately we will talk about in just a moment. But to make something like this really is a statement of intent in a number of ways, and I think speaks very good things about the brand. But they built up to this. Something that they've released much earlier is the C1 Moonglow, which maxes out on this mesh bracelet at $2,385. And I've seen this watch in person, and it's mesmerizing to look at because The dial is a sandwich dial. The moon phase is the size of the inner portion of the dial, and the bottom portion is actually smoky sapphire. So you can still sort of see the second moon disk peeking out from underneath, but in person it just has a really nice romantic quality to the watch at 40.5 millimeters in steel. Just I think probably also Christopher Ward, I would hypothesize experimenting with building complicated watches and seeing what their audience would respond to. The next one is the C63 SH21, and this is sort of as we climb down the price ladder, which retails at most for $2,110. 5-day power reserve on an automatic movement that is COSC certified and happens to be in-house. And now, of course, we're talking about, the sports watch as well, because this literally just came out, the 12, which maxes out on a titanium bracelet at $1,895. It's just impressive that a brand which started just a couple of decades ago is able to produce watches of such a variety and such aesthetic and functional diversity and complication diversity while keeping them at incredibly accessible price points. And so we'll round out sort of just a set of watches we're talking about for now with the C65 chronograph for $1,800. They make watches in steel, in bronze, in forged carbon, titanium. They make GMT watches, chronographs, divers, time and date watches only, other complications. They have reportedly in the press said that they make around 25,000 watches a year, which means if you compare it to numbers published by Morgan Stanley for the primary market, they make more watches a year than Bell and Ross or than Zenith. But they're not making as many watches as, for example, Oris, or certainly not bigger brands like Hamilton or Tudor. But they've been around since 2005, and what they called their 3-part plan on their website is to sell customers their watches directly through their own website, apply a maximum of 3 times markup on the manufacturing price, and lastly, avoid the costly celebrity endorsements to which the Swiss brands seem addicted, quote unquote. And I think that shows in the value for money that these watches really represent once you get to hold them in the metal, even at the lower end of the price range. For example, I think the most affordable watch they make is around $800. I don't know if that's the version that comes on a bracelet, but the one that does, the bracelet features a micro adjustment on the clasp, which for a watch that cheap, that puts to shame watches that cost many multiples of that much money. And they're made to an incredibly high value, high quality of finish for that much money as well. So I think across all of this, and given the fact that they've just released the 12 and integrated bracelet sports watch trend is going to die an inevitable death, but does not seem to be dying as quickly as some may have initially expected this year. That's a watch that they just released, and it's a doozy of a release, especially given how thin it is with its ergonomics. I would expect that because it fixes some of the ergonomics issues that other brands that have attempted this genre have not been able to do, certainly not at this price point, that this will be a successful watch for them. And given that they're already sort of booked out on 2023 Bel Canto deliveries, definitely up and coming for 2023. Which brands do you think are poised to outcompete the rest in 2023? Do you disagree with any of our picks? Let us know in the comments below, and we're going to stick with our new schedule and keep posting new videos every Tuesday and Friday going forward. So hopefully see you in the next one. Thanks for listening.